Hi, are you one of those people that talks to yourself? Hey, if you do, it's okay. Because you see, God himself set the example for us. In Genesis 8, where we finished up last week, we saw God talking to himself as he received Noah's offering after the flood. Genesis 8:21 and 22, then the Lord said in his heart, talking to himself, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. Here is God talking to himself. He is promising himself that he's never going to do these things again. And that these other things, the cycle of seasons, that they're going to remain. This is something that God did not say to Noah yet, but something that he said, this is what I'm going to do. Well, as we move ahead today to Genesis 9, we're going to see the Noahic Covenant in verses 1 through 17. It contains a detailed description in God's own words of his response to Noah after leaving the flood. These verses contain not just the Noahic Covenant for Noah, but it also contains a covenant made that carries on to the post-flood mankind, and it's still in effect. Thousands of years later, this is a covenant that we enjoy, that we partake in. Starts out with God's command. And when you think about God commanding you to do something, a lot of times you think about the 10 Commandments and how harsh they are. Well, this is one that brings life. 9:1 says, so God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. You see, here God's no longer just talking to himself. He is also talking to Noah and to his sons. We see that the sons are brought in to the covenant with Noah. God promised Noah before the flood that he was going to make a covenant with him. And here we see that it includes all of his family, all of his future family, all of us. And this is a time that God is reminding them, only going further than the covenant or promise that he made to Adam and Eve. You see, in the beginning, God did bless Adam and Eve with the ability to procreate and the privilege to rule as co-regents with him over the entire earth. But there in the garden, Adam and Eve sinned. And even though they sinned, God promised that a Redeemer would come because he wanted to continue his plan that he had set up from before the foundation of the world. His plan was to bless the human family. And so he preserved a righteous seed, a righteous line through their son Seth. Now, the blessing on Noah's family provided a new beginning for man as the promises were again given. The very same promise that he gave to Adam and Eve in the garden were restated here. You see, repopulating the earth by Noah's family was so important because it means that human civilization began again with a shared understanding of the earliest human history, including creation and the flood stories. Those families on the ark, those 8 people, during that time, Noah had opportunity to write down stories that he had heard from his ancestors, stories about creation, about the fall, and about not only his family, Seth's, but also about Cain's family and all the things that they did. And then he wrote about the flood and all the events of that. Now, Noah didn't have pen and paper or even a scroll. No, he wrote it on clay, and it was preserved. It was preserved through the years, through the generations. And then after the flood, the family had lots of time because Noah was going to be around for another 300 years. He had time to share with his family, story after story after story. And you know what? When you hear that same story over and over, maybe you've heard some of them from your mom or grandma or grandpa. It gets almost to the place, if they're really good storytellers, that you could just tell it back to them. Well, that's the way it was with Noah. He told the same story in the same way, word for word, over and over. Well, now we're going to look at some of the God's provisions for them. He said, this is what I want you to do. And it's like, and now this is how I'm going to provide for you and how I want you to live. I've made provision, and I've also made some stipulation. Genesis 9:2, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the air and on all that move on the earth and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. You know, supremacy given to man over the animal world expressed here was much more forcible than it was when God said the same thing almost to Adam. In Genesis 1:28, he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds and over every living thing that moves. The two phrases, fear of you and dread of you, basically in Hebrew, they mean the same thing. God designed animals from this point on to have just an inherent fear of and dread when humans are around. Animals recognize that we have authority over them. And many animals will not attack you unless they're afraid. They're afraid that you're going to capture them. They're afraid you're going to hurt them. They're afraid you're going to corner them. And if they get afraid, then they will attack. Then they'll move out. But basically, animals, since the flood, have been made so that you leave them alone, they leave you alone. And perhaps this fear was given to protect man and to ensure that they could multiply and fill the earth. Genesis 9:3 says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. Maybe this is another reason for the fear. Man, for the first time, is given permission to eat animals. In the beginning, God only gave him permission to eat plants. Genesis 1:29. See, I've given you every green herb that you'll see, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit you'll see. To you it shall be for food. God now extended the categories from which man could eat and said, you can eat every moving thing. Stipulations about clean and unclean animals, that doesn't come along until Moses' time. But even though God did this, it doesn't necessarily prove that man had never tasted meat before. Maybe some of Cain's family had. What it does prove to us is for the first time God has given man permission, allowing him to eat meat. Now, I can't tell you why God extended this diet to include the meat rather than just the plants, and I don't know that anyone else can either. But, there's some theories going around that may not be bad, and maybe one of them's even right. We've already talked about to protect men, not just from animals, but by curbing their potential growth. They were growing exponentially, and if man had not been allowed to kill and to eat some of them, they surely would have been outnumbered soon. Perhaps a more rigorous environment required a protein diet, such as could be enforced or supplied by animals. And then, maybe after the flood, there were no vegetations, no vegetables for them to eat. And, Even though the dove came back with the olive leaves, you can only eat olive leaves for so long. So there's a number of reasons why it could happen, but we don't know why. 9:4 says, but you shall not eat flesh with its life. That is the blood. God set a real stipulation here. He allowed Noah to eat meat as long as it was not consumed while its lifeblood was still in it. Now, this prohibition emphasizes the sacredness of life, as blood is a symbol of the animal's life. Flesh, or the meat, was given for food, but the blood, or the life of the flesh, was given for sacrifice, as clarified to us by the law of Moses. Leviticus 17:11 makes it really clear when it says, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. The blood of animals representing their life was not to be eaten, since it was accepted in sacrifice in place of, or as a substitute for, the life of man. And in the Old Testament, you can go through the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all that and see how they were told to offer sacrifices. The word life is the same as the Hebrew word for soul, nephesh. And that life is what distinguishes animal life from plant life. Plants do not have a soul. Genesis 5:6. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it. From the hand of man. And from the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. God here places a supreme value on human life, because each one of us is made in the image of God. That humans are the only creatures made in the image of God is key to understanding what this is all about and understanding these verses. The image of God is still in man. God said in the beginning, let us make man in our own image. And sin did not destroy it. What God made man to be, what God made you to be, it continues after the fall. After Adam and Eve sinned, they were still in the image of God. And you, after you sin, after you blow it so bad, you think, how can God even look at me? How can God ever forgive me? God still loves you. He still cares for you because you are made in His image. Oh, God will never stop loving His creation. And you are that very special part of His creation, the one made in His image. Yes, animals do have a soul and they have a body, but only man has an eternal spirit. Only man was created in the image of God, and only for man did Jesus come as God's Son to die as a supreme sacrifice. In these verses, there is the word require. He says, if every man's brother, I will require the life of man. And he says, and if from every beast, I will require it. Require, as used here, is a judicial term, a legal term. And God is the judge, not just any judge, but He is the judge that's spoken of here, who exacts a very precise and severe penalty for anyone that would dare bring any infraction on His law. And one of the things that He condemns or sees as the greatest infraction is murder. As He told Noah that he would even require an animal's life if it were to kill a man. In Exodus, he says, if an ox gores a man or a woman, that oxen is to be killed. God did not only require this retribution from animals, but he also required it from a man who would willfully kill or murder another human being. He too must be put to death. It says by every man's brother. Now, the reason it says every man's brother here is because when God gave the commandment at this time, there were only 4 families. There was Noah and his wife, and the 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their wives. 4 families. And every future family descended from these 3 brothers and their wives. So that means that all judicial relations and all ordinances at that time were centered in the family and developed as a natural process out of that. But this command was not ever intended to sanction revenge, but to lay the foundation for civil government with a divinely appointed authority. And as you read in Romans, you read the New Testament, we see that civil law was still there in the New Testament, and it is today. You see, this was important because God had said to himself that he would never again destroy the earth because of man's sinfulness. But God also knew our heart. And he said that the imaginations of man is evil even from his youth. And so God had to set up a system. He had to set up a barrier with regulations and authorities against the reign of evil. And that's why that was set up. Well, we've looked at these 3 provisions. And we think, that's pretty good. It's good for Noah and his family. Pretty good for all the Jews to go by in the Jewish law, even the Old Testament. But we're not in the Old Testament. And we're not Jews, most of us listening. We're Christians. What about us? Well, you know what? These 3 provisions were not set aside by New Testament Christianity. Timothy tells us that the eating of meat is regulated. When Paul went to the Jerusalem church and talked about accepting Gentiles into the church, Gentiles are you and me, they said, okay, just don't let them eat the blood. That was carried out in Acts 15. And then in Romans 13, as I've already mentioned, the authority of government was set up and clarified that it's still going on. So these are not just Jewish Old Testament laws that could be rejected, but they're part of man's original covenant with all of mankind. I'm going to give you a little peek of where we're going next session. Because you see, Genesis 9, 7 through 9a says, God's speaking. And he says, and for you, be fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, as for me, behold, I will. See, first, God reminded Noah of what his responsibility was, what his son's great responsibility was. He says, your responsibility is to be fruitful, to multiply, to furnish the earth to fill it. But then he said, I will do this. God stated his responsibility, which is a promise that comes with a sure sign of hope for us, for you and for me. A hope that we have every time that we go through a storm. A hope, whether it's a physical storm with the thunders and the lightnings outside, or an internal storm. God has a promise for us. And it's that promise that we're going to be talking about next week.